right, that was an amazing story about multiple stories. Our next presenter is Akshay. Akshay is an innovator, he's an entrepreneur, he's an amazing person, but one of the things that's special about him is he has two very interesting stories which he's going to share with you about what happens on the inside of this creative process and how that affects us and how it relates to us as teenagers.
Hi, so I'm 17 and ever since I was very young, it was very difficult for me to stay hooked to one thing. I needed something new to tinker with. I wanted to move on. I was a very mentally restless child, if you were to put it that way. Now, this trait led me into a field into which I had never imagined I would find myself in, and is very less heard of for teenagers to be in. This led me to found two ventures. The first being Ukhadlo.com. Yeah, that's what we named it, Ukhadlo.com. So Ukhadlo.com was founded in 2013 when India was going through recession, and there was a very common cliche sentence which said, I want to be my own boss, I want to start up on my own, right? So Ukhadlo was an online portal where entrepreneurs, investors, co-founders, angels, incubators and accelerators could come together, network in one place and launch really cool startups. After working on Ukhadlo, which happened during my 10th grade, I needed to write my board exams and I had to put Ukhadlo on the side burner for a while. And before I could get back to working on Ukhadlo, I needed to find a school for myself for the 11th grade because my current school was just the 10th. The harrowing experiences of a task as simple as finding a school for myself is what gave birth to the second venture, which we called ClassFever.com. Now ClassFever.com was originally an online review aggregator for schools to help parents make an informed decision about their child's future. Soon the company transformed, the startup transformed, and today ClassFever is a big data company and we rank all schools across Maharashtra based on statistical analysis and taking into parent feedback. So we use 32 variables and we crunch 20 million variables per school across 6 different factors to produce one single rank for every school every time you visit ClassFever. Both these ventures were equally featured in the media, and I have spent a total of 2 years in this field. When I spent all this time in the field, I realized that it presented me with an enigma. There are more failures than there are successes in the startup field. You don't need me to tell you that anywhere between 70 to 80% startups fail in the first few years of functioning, right? So according to Forbes and Statistical Brain, 70 to 80% of the startups fail in the first few years. It is so heartbreaking to see people peg it onto the startups for failure. The perceived reasons for failure include the startup wasn't innovative enough. You don't have the operational inefficient, you're very operationally inefficient, you don't have the business acumen. And oh, you know what, you failed because you didn't have enough money. As simple as that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that when a startup fails, or any company fails for that matter, it is not only the startup's fault. We as consumers of the economy have an equal part to take, and sadly we have not realized that yet. So I'm here to tell you the difference between the perceived reason and the actual reason of startups, at least in India. So why do startups fail? Let's shift lenses and look at the reasons. 1, there is a gross over-glamification of the startup space in India. Secondly, startups fail when they begin to act like companies, and they also fail when the consumer is unable to differentiate between a startup and a company. On a very high level, a startup becomes a company when you see its first ad on TV, and if a person is in a suit, he runs a company. If he is in jeans and a tattered shirt, he looks sleep deprived, he is running a startup. So yes, inside out, what do consumers have to do with startup failure? Let's take the story of a man in an economy of a country, and the process goes such: glamification, later comes startups acting like companies, and after that comes consumers being unable to differentiate. At each stage, a few startups fall out of the race. The first step, we have the consumer looks into the space and sees a lot of money flowing. So recently, Ola Cabs raised $500 million, and Flipkart has been raising billions of dollars every now and then. Now in India, such amount of money is only talked in two cases, either in closed boardroom meetings of big companies, Tatas, Ambanis, Birlas, or in government scams. When we talk about this model of startup failure, including consumers, we look at the first stage when we say there's too much money. There is so much money that the consumer is absolutely sensationalized and he thinks all is well. Secondly, the consumer is unable to differentiate between the valuation of a company and the funding it has raised. So if a company raises 10 crore rupees at 10%, the company is valued at 100 crores, but the company doesn't actually have 100 crores to spend. The average consumer associates the company with 100 crore rupees and his expectations shoot up. And that's where a lot of startups fall out of the race. Also, all this glamification is very attractive to people who believe they cannot work under somebody and hence they should start up. People like, I can't work under somebody, I was destined to be my own boss. People like those. Let's assume the person survives this first stage, right? He is able to control himself through the glamification. Stage 2, the person is so primed to believe that he cannot function without funding, his primary focus shifts from actually building the company to raising funds. So when we were starting out with ClassFever, out of the 8 months that we spent launching the company, I spent 4 months pitching to investors and it yielded nothing. It yielded absolutely nothing. I wasted a lot of time, a lot of money, and was only heartbroken because the investors tried to entangle me in jargon like churn rate, burn rate, consumer retention rate, and sales cycles. I didn't know. My product wasn't ready yet. Well, we said we'll put a stop to trying to raise funds and let's first try to complete our product. Also, when a lot of these entrepreneurs begin to get office space before they're revenue positive or their product is stable, they fall out of the race. When they have a fake sense of stability, they begin choosing instead of being hungry. Being hungry is associated with a trait of a startup, right? You're supposed to be hungry. But when a person starts closing his doors and picks his dishes prematurely, that's where the problem starts. Even at this stage, if we assume the person survives through all of this chaos, he survives being tuned out by the investors, having setbacks, he reaches the third stage. The third stage is when he has a stable venture, he is market ready, and he's probably trying to sell a concept, but he is overall stable and he is ready to go to the market. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where the consumers, we are to blame. Because right up till this point, 80% of startups fail in the first two stages and only 20% of the failures come from the third stage. It's the classic rule of 80-20. Also because when a startup is selling a concept like Flipkart, so Flipkart had to sell the concept of buying things online before it could sell a single product online. Now, if we have the rule of 80-20 in that aspect, we have the 80-20 rule in the reverse aspect. 80% of the startups which fail were doing only 20% of the business, while the 20% which survive actually do 80% of the business. These 20% of the startups failed because of the consumers. So, in the end, we can conclude that the consumer is to blame for the bad startup industry and startup failures. Yes, so up till the first two stages, the entrepreneur was to blame. In the last stage, it's the consumer to blame. Now, for the consumer, right, this was all the mistake of the entrepreneur. When a consumer looks into the economy, he sees a lot of money flowing. He is unable to differentiate between a company and a startup, and what he sees is this. Instead of this, he sees that. He sees a lot of money, he sees a lot of new concepts, he is unable to differentiate if it's a startup or a company. So if I were to begin expecting a food delivery startup's delivery boy to speak impeccable English, I would be very wrong. I should start judging them on the food, right? So what we have, we essentially have 3 layers of reality distortion between the consumer and the actual entrepreneur. This is what causes majority of the startups to fail. contrasting to what people actually believe, that the startups failed because they weren't innovative enough or they didn't know how to run the startup. That is a reason, yes. But there is also another reason which says it's the consumer's fault. If the consumer isn't open to accepting new concepts, right? So we recently had an advent of laundry startups which would pick up the clothing from your house, take it to some remote unknown place, wash it, dry clean it, pack it and send it back to you. How many of us still rely on the local dhobi, right? We don't really trust these laundry startups because we are complacent with our dhobi. Now if you think about it this way, if you actually start using the laundry startup, the dhobi will anyways get employed by the startup at some later date and the startup would have survived. Why did it fail? Because we were very close-minded and we said, nahi, our dhobi is very good, he washes my clothes very well. So how do we solve this? Firstly, we should understand the vocabulary of any startup or any entrepreneur for that matter. When the entrepreneur says, we are diversifying, he's essentially telling you, we are trying a lot of other things, we are trying everything we possibly can in hopes that one of the many things we're trying works. If he says these are exciting times, he's literally telling you we have more work than we can handle. If he says we've recently been funded, he's just telling you we don't own our company any longer, we've sold it. If he's telling you we have evolved, this is very common. If he tells you we've evolved, he's basically telling you we have absolutely no idea what we're doing. We started out to do something completely different, but something completely different sold in the market. Moving on. So, well, knowing the startup vocabulary is essential for you to differentiate between a company and a startup. But more importantly, you should be open to new concepts, right? So if Zivame.com is selling online lingerie, people have to be open-minded enough, कि चलो ठीक है, that's a viable concept. Same with Flipkart, Snapdeal, fashion brands, right? They're trying to sell clothing online. But people think, how can I buy it without touching, feeling the fabric? That's where the concept, a new concept is killed even before it can take root. Have rational expectations. We talked about this with the food startup example and the delivery boy knowing English. And finally, explore new concepts and be informed. Be informed that the entity you're interacting with, is it a startup? Is it new? Is it a really big mammoth in the field? How old is it? I know it's tedious to do this, but if you take this effort, irrespective of the country you belong to, you will have helped a startup in your country. Now we all know that Flipkart is a big deal in India because it's one of the biggest companies India has given rise to, and it has the power to challenge Amazon, which has been in the field for very, very long. If we are able to support startups as consumers when they are young, we will not only have national startups, but we have the capacity to foster global startups which can bring actual change. A lot of new startups which have mind-boggling ideas are killed and die out at this stage because the consumers aren't willing to accept them. Right? And finally, yes, we talked about global startups and national startups. To conclude, yes, this talk was to blame the consumer as an equal partaker in the failure of startups. This was also to tell you that to the consumer, when he's on the outside, if he sees all the glam, he's himself incited to enter the startup space. That increases competition, more startups fail. So think before you step into the startup field. Please don't be fooled by the glamour. And yes, support new startups. Thank you.